The first time Landon Hayes tasted power, it was bitter, like whiskey on an empty stomach. The second time, it tasted like silence. Control. And now, years later, it tasted like victory. Or so he believed. The wind at the top of Hayes Tower howled like a warning, but inside the penthouse office, Landon stood untouched, godlike, overlooking Chicago. Every light below was a transaction he had conquered. Every building in view, a negotiation he'd won. He had clawed his way from nothing to become one of the most formidable real estate moguls in the country. And in less than 48 hours, he was going to marry Isabel Rothschild. It should have felt like the summit. It didn't. A single envelope sat untouched on his glass desk. Black. Heavy. The ink etched like calligraphy from another world. It bore the name of the one woman he had trained himself to forget. Mira Langford. She had once been his world, until she vanished without explanation, without a trace. No forwarding address. No goodbye. Just, gone. He had woken up one morning and found her side of the bed cold and empty, her presence erased like a ghost that never existed. No note. No closure. Only rumors. He never chased her. Not because he didn't want to, but because she had made it clear, she had chosen to disappear. But now, after nearly a decade of silence, Landon had sent her an invitation. To his wedding. It wasn't a gesture of peace. It wasn't about forgiveness. It was strategy. A move calculated with the same precision he used in business. Let her see what he had become. Let her stand in the back of the ballroom and watch him marry the kind of woman Mira could never become, composed, pedigreed, untouchable. Isabel was an empire in pearls. Mira had been fire. Unpredictable. Dangerous. And yet. He hadn't stopped thinking about her, not really. Some nights, when the city outside went dark, he still wondered what had happened to her. Why she had left. If it had meant anything to her at all. If she'd ever loved him, or if he'd just been a stepping stone she outgrew. Landon picked up the black envelope and turned it over in his hand. Her name, embossed in silver, shimmered beneath the lights. He didn't expect her to show. But if she did, he needed to be ready. He needed her to feel it. Julia entered without knocking. As always. His sister had a way of moving through his life like she owned it, polished, sharp, and always 3 steps ahead of everyone else. Dressed in a slate gray suit that cost more than some people made in a month, she leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "You're still holding that?" she asked, her voice casual, but her eyes glittering. "What are you hoping for, an apology?" Landon didn't look up. "No. Closure, then." She laughed, too loud for the room. "Come on, Landon." If she were going to say anything, she would have done it 8 years ago. "She's going to show." "She won't." "She will," he said, finally turning toward her. "Because Mira doesn't know how to walk away from a challenge. And nothing would bruise her ego more than pretending none of this matters." Julia stepped closer. "You're playing with fire." Landon smiled coldly. "I always do." She narrowed her eyes. "This isn't a negotiation. You're not sitting across from some hedge fund CEO. This is different. This is personal," Landon finished. Julia studied him, searching for a crack in the armor. "You're not doing this for revenge." "No. You're doing it because you want her to regret leaving," she said, softer now. "And you want to see it on her face." He didn't answer. "I just hope you're ready if she brings a +1, Julia added with a smirk. "You know, a husband. A kid. A life." Landon said nothing. Because in truth, he hadn't thought about that. And now, he couldn't stop. He imagined her walking into the ballroom, draped in red, her hand held by someone else. He pictured her laughing, unfazed, as if she hadn't disappeared, and left him wondering who the hell he had been to her. That image burned hotter than any rage he had ever felt. But it wasn't anger that kept him up at night. It was the question. Why? He had power now. Status. The kind of wealth that shut doors behind you forever. But not even all of Chicago could give him that answer. He poured another glass of whiskey and downed it in one gulp. Outside, the lights of the city blinked like stars. He imagined Mira somewhere beneath them, receiving the invitation. He imagined her fingers tracing his name. Her breath catching. Her hands shaking. And then he imagined her smile. No. He crushed that image. This was his wedding. His moment. She didn't get to haunt it. Across the city, deep in a quieter neighborhood where the world spun slower, Mira Langford sat at her kitchen table, her daughters asleep down the hall. The black envelope lay open in front of her. She had read it 3 times. And every time, her heart pounded like she was 25 again. Landon Hayes. Even now, the name had power over her. A name that once meant safety, fire, and dreams built late at night under broken ceilings. She hadn't left because she stopped loving him. She had left because she had to. And he never knew why. She ran her fingers along the invitation. It was excessive, of course. Embossed in real gold. Venue printed in serif font like a royal decree, the Peninsula Chicago. Formal. Lavish. Cold. Exactly what Landon had become. Exactly what she had protected the girls from. She thought about throwing the invitation away. About burning it. About pretending it had never arrived. But some truths don't stay buried. Some ghosts deserve to be faced. And some names cannot be erased. Not when they call you Dad and don't even know it. Back at Hayes Tower, Landon rehearsed the toast he would give after the ceremony. Every word would drip with elegance. Charm. Success. But somewhere between the jokes and metaphors, there was a line he planned to deliver slowly, deliberately. To the ones who walked away before they saw what I became. And when he raised his glass and caught Myra's eye across the crowd, she would know exactly who he meant. That was the plan. But Landon Hayes had no idea what Mira Langford was about to bring to his perfect, curated wedding. And when she walked through those grand ballroom doors 2 nights later, he wouldn't be ready. No one would. Not for the twin daughters who looked just like him. And not for the truth that would unravel everything. The envelope hadn't moved since she opened it. It sat on the edge of the kitchen counter like a curse, like a dare, like a memory come to life. Mira Langford stared at it for the 3rd morning in a row, her coffee untouched, her fingers tapping slowly against the rim of the mug. Outside, the oak trees swayed in the Savannah wind. Inside, her daughters played on the living room rug, still in their pajamas, building a castle out of blocks that leaned too far to one side. Mira watched them quietly, Sophie's laughter, Stella's concentration, their differences already as stark as their resemblance. 7 years ago, she had walked out of Chicago carrying both of them in her body, in her silence, and in her fear. She had built a life that was soft, invisible, safe. But the invitation threatened all of it. Landon Hayes was getting married. And he had invited her. She hadn't decided yet if it was an insult or a challenge. Maybe both. But what haunted her most was not his cruelty, it was his ignorance. He didn't know about Sophie and Stella. He didn't know what he had missed. And now, after all this time, Mira didn't know if he deserved to. Later that night, after the girls had fallen asleep with their legs tangled under the covers, Mira opened the old chest she kept in the back of her closet. Inside were memories she hadn't allowed herself to revisit in years. Tucked beneath baby blankets and ultrasound prints were letters, unsent, unacknowledged, unread. The first one she ever wrote was scribbled on hospital stationery, just after she'd found out she was pregnant. "Landon. You're going to be a father." She had written the words with trembling hands, convinced that if she just explained it the right way, he would listen. He would respond. He would fight for her. For them. But he never answered. She called. She emailed. She showed up at his office once, only to be turned away by a new assistant who looked at her like she was delusional. After that, Mira stopped trying. Or rather, she stopped expecting anything. She stared now at the letter in her lap. The ink had faded, but the pain was still sharp. This wasn't just about revenge. This wasn't about showing up at his wedding to throw a match on the pristine world he had created. It was about Sophie asking last week, "Why don't we have a dad?" and Mira freezing, mouth dry, heart in her throat. It was about Stella, who asked fewer questions but looked longer at strangers, as if searching for a face that made sense. It was about not lying anymore. She stood, suddenly overwhelmed with motion, and walked to their bedroom. The moonlight pooled through the windows, casting the girls in silver. She touched each of their foreheads and whispered a promise she had been avoiding for years. "It's time." The decision didn't come with clarity. It came with dread. Packing was harder than expected, not just the logistics of traveling with two 7-year-olds, but the emotional weight of returning to a city that had spit her out and dared her to disappear. She booked a small suite at a boutique hotel near Lake Shore Drive, far enough from the wedding venue to feel removed, but close enough to arrive without notice. The girls were ecstatic. To them, it was an adventure. Their first trip to Chicago. Big buildings, fancy clothes, mysterious invitations. "What's the wedding for?" Sophie asked on the plane, chewing gum with exaggerated purpose. "It's for an old friend," Mira said carefully. "Is he nice?" Stella asked, her voice quieter. Mira looked out the window. "He was, once." She didn't sleep on the flight. Her mind was too loud. Every version of how the next few days could unfold played like a loop, some ending in confrontation, others in silence, none of them ending in peace. What would Landon say when he saw them? What would Isabel do? Would he believe her? Would the truth matter? When they arrived at the hotel, Mira took the girls up to the room and let them run to the window. The view was breathtaking, skyline stretching like a crown, the river glinting beneath it, boats leaving wakes like signatures. "It looks like a dream," Sophie whispered. "No," Mira thought. "It looks like the place I stopped dreaming." She turned away, gathered herself, and unpacked in silence. The morning of the wedding arrived in a hush. Rain threatened but never fell. The streets were slick with anticipation. Mira dressed the girls slowly, her fingers more unsteady than usual. The navy blue dresses were simple but elegant, matched with soft cardigans and shoes they had picked out themselves. Mira chose a dress she hadn't worn since her sister's funeral, deep green, long-sleeved, modest. She pinned her hair back and added no jewelry. She didn't come to sparkle. She came to be seen. She didn't tell the girls who they were about to meet. Not yet. They walked into the lobby of the Peninsula and Mira paused. Everything was polished. Orchids in crystal vases. Music rising like perfume. A line of luxury cars outside. This was Landon's world now. She wondered if it had always been. "Are you okay, Mom?" Stella asked, taking her hand. Mira nodded. "Let's go." The ballroom was already full when they arrived. Champagne flutes. Strings. Diamonds. Laughter that echoed too loud. And there he was. Landon Hayes. Standing near the altar. A tuxedo tailored to dominance. Hair swept back like it obeyed him. Hands clasped behind his back as he surveyed the crowd. He hadn't seen her yet. But she saw him. And for a moment, the floor tilted beneath her. He looked, untouched. As if 8 years had passed over him, not through him. Still devastatingly handsome. Still dangerous. Sophie tugged on her arm. Mom. That man. He looks like. Myra's voice trembled. I know. Then Landon turned. Their eyes met. The orchestra didn't stop playing, but everything else did. He didn't move. Didn't blink. Didn't breathe. She watched the understanding rip through him like lightning. From her face to Sophie's curls. To Stella's eyes. To the identical curve of their jaws. The whiskey glass in his hand lowered. His lips parted. And for the first time in a decade, Mira saw him vulnerable. She stepped forward. And chaos began. Landon Hayes didn't remember putting down the glass. He didn't remember the music slowing or the voices around him fading. All he knew was the woman in the green dress standing just inside the ballroom doors. And the two little girls who looked like they had walked out of a dream he hadn't dared admit he'd ever had. Time fractured. 1 second, he was the groom-to-be, admired, respected, untouchable. The next, he was a man watching the foundation of his perfectly calculated life splinter into shards. He took 1 step forward. The sound of it echoed against the marble like a gunshot. Mira didn't flinch. Neither did the girls. He stared at them, their wide eyes, their matching curls, the impossible symmetry of their faces, and felt his chest cave inward. They couldn't be older than 7. 7. Which would mean. No. It couldn't be. He looked at Mira, searching her face for something, denial, guilt, explanation. But all he found there was steel and sorrow. She didn't look away. She didn't cower. If anything, she looked like she had expected this moment for years. Behind him, Isabel appeared at his side. What is this? She whispered, her voice already taut with panic. The crowd had turned now, subtle at first, heads tilting, whispers born, tension tightening like a noose. There were no cameras, not yet. But there would be. Landon took another step forward. And then another. And then he was in front of Mira, closer than he'd been in nearly a decade. The scent of her was the same, lavender and loss. His voice was low, guttural. What is this? Myra's chin lifted. What you should have known a long time ago. His gaze dropped to the girls again. One of them clung lightly to the fabric of Myra's dress. The other just looked at him, unblinking. He cleared his throat, but no words followed. His hands clenched at his sides. You left, he said, his voice hoarse. You disappeared. You didn't. I tried to tell you, she interrupted. You wouldn't let me. That's not true. It is. Mira. I called. I wrote. I showed up. I stood outside your office until security threatened to call the police. And when I still wouldn't go, I got a letter. Her voice cracked for the first time, just slightly. A letter from your legal team. Telling me to stay away. He felt like she had punched him. His mind reeled, images of those years rushing past him, the days of building, of pushing forward, all the while believing she had left him cold. Why didn't you try again? He asked, almost to himself. I did. And then I stopped. Because you had made it very clear that I was no longer part of your life. He opened his mouth to protest, but nothing came. From beside him, Isabel's voice sliced through the tension. Who are they? Mira looked at her. Calm. Direct. His daughters. The ballroom fell into a hush so deep, it felt like a cathedral. A gasp came from somewhere in the back. Glass shattered. A fork hit the ground. But Landon heard none of it. His daughters. Not strangers. Not guests. Not bystanders. His. He turned to Mira again, but before he could speak, one of the girls, Sophie, though he didn't yet know her name, tugged Myra's sleeve. "Mommy," she whispered, too soft for the crowd but loud enough for Landon to hear. "Mommy." The word hit him in the chest. And in that same instant, he realized he had missed everything. First smiles. First steps. First words. Every bedtime story. Every scraped knee. Every Christmas morning. All stolen from him by time and silence and something he didn't yet understand. Sophie looked up at him, then back at Mira. "Is he, the friend you said we were going to meet?" Mira hesitated. Then nodded. "Yes." The other girl, Stella, was still watching Landon with quiet scrutiny. She said nothing. Her eyes were darker. Wiser. Like she understood this wasn't just a reunion. It was an upheaval. Landon knelt. The move shocked even him. He didn't know what he was doing, only that he needed to be eye level. That something inside him couldn't bear to tower over them. Not when they were his. "I don't know what to say," he said, quietly, mostly to them, maybe to Mira, maybe to himself. "You don't have to say anything," Mira replied. "Not here." Behind him, Isabel was trembling. "You knew," she whispered. "You knew this woman had kids and you invited her anyway?" "I didn't know," Landon said, standing now, his voice harder. "I had no idea." She looked between him and Mira. "But you believe her?" He didn't respond. "Do you believe her, Landon?" He turned back to the girls. "Yes," he said, without hesitation. "I do." Isabel's breath left her body in a single, bitter exhale. "You believe her because you want to." "I believe her because they have my eyes." She said nothing after that. Neither did the crowd. Mira glanced at the wedding planner, whose face had gone pale, and whispered, "We should go." But Landon stepped forward. "No. Not yet. We need to talk." "Not here." "Yes. Here." He looked around the ballroom, at the elite society who had come to watch him marry a Rothschild and instead had been given a scandal worthy of headlines. "Everyone came here to celebrate something real," he said. "So let's give them truth instead." Isabel turned and walked away. Not out of fury. But out of knowing that this moment had nothing to do with her anymore. Mira touched both girls gently and guided them toward a side exit. Landon followed, steps unsure, throat dry, heart pounding with the weight of 7 years he could never reclaim. Outside the ballroom, in a quiet corridor behind the reception hall, Mira turned to him. "You want answers," she said. "I want them all." She looked at him for a long time. "You might not like what you hear." He didn't care. "What are their names?" he asked. She paused. "Sophie," she said, nodding to the bold one. "And Stella." He said the names under his breath. Like prayer. Like penance. "They're beautiful." "They're yours," she said. "They always have been." He stepped back. Like the words hit him physically. "Why didn't anyone tell me?" he asked. "Why didn't someone, Julia, David, why didn't anyone?" Myra's eyes hardened. "That's something you'll have to ask them." And suddenly, the pieces began to fall. The silence. The way Julia always changed the subject when Mira came up. The way David looked away now whenever her name was mentioned. He clenched his jaw. "I will." For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Sophie tugged her mother's sleeve again. "Can we still go to the party?" Mira smiled softly. "This was the party, sweetheart." Stella looked up at Landon. Still guarded. Still quiet. "Are you going to yell at mommy?" Landon knelt again. This time slower. More certain. No, he said. I would never. She nodded once. Then turned back to Mira and whispered, he sounds like you. And Mira, for the first time in years, felt something shift. Something inside her, tight and rigid, began to crack open. Landon stood. I don't want to fight, he said. But I need to talk. I need to know everything. I'll tell you, she replied. Tonight? She shook her head. Tomorrow. Somewhere private. Just us. He nodded. And for the first time, as she walked away, leading their daughters down the hallway and into the night, Landon didn't feel like a man who had just lost everything. He felt like a man who had just discovered the one thing he never knew he was missing. Landon couldn't sleep. The suite he returned to that night was drenched in silence. The luxury he once took pride in, soft lighting, expensive linens, the scent of cedarwood and success, now felt suffocating. The mirrors on the walls reflected a man who no longer understood the life he had built. He stood at the window, overlooking Chicago's glittering skyline, wondering how many truths had been buried beneath those lights. Myra's words replayed in his mind with crushing clarity. I tried to tell you. You wouldn't let me. He remembered the early days after she disappeared, how quickly Julia had stepped in, urging him to move on. How David, his most trusted confidant, had said, she's not who you thought she was. At the time, it had made sense. He had felt abandoned. Betrayed. And they had offered him certainty where he had only confusion. But now? Now it felt like a trap. He picked up his phone and dialed. David answered after the second ring. Landon. We need to talk. Now. The pause was long. Okay. My place. No. Come here. And bring everything. David didn't ask what everything meant. He just said, I'll be there in 20. Landon hung up and poured himself a drink he wouldn't touch. When the knock came, it was sharp, fast, urgent. David stepped into the suite carrying a slim black folder. His eyes were wary, shoulders tense. You look like hell, he said. Sit, Landon replied. David obeyed. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Landon gestured to the folder. What's in it? David slid it across the table. Copies of everything Mira sent. Letters. Voicemails. Even an email log. I didn't want to believe her at first, but after last night, I went digging. Landon opened the folder. The first thing he saw was a letter. Postmarked 7 years ago. Landon, I know you probably don't want to hear from me, but please. This is important. I'm pregnant. He read it again. Pregnant. His stomach twisted. Another letter followed. Then voicemails, transcribed with timestamps, her calling again and again. Her words raw, pleading. I just need you to hear me. I didn't leave to hurt you. I left because I was scared. I'm still scared. I don't want money. I want you to know the truth. I'm carrying your daughters, Landon. Landon's breath left his lungs in a slow, stunned silence. I never saw these, he whispered. I know, David said. Julia intercepted them. All of them. Landon looked up, eyes sharp. You knew. David hesitated. I knew, something. Not the extent. Not the pregnancy. But I knew Julia didn't want Mira in your life. She said Mira was unstable, that she'd ruin everything you were building. And you just went along with it. I was trying to protect you, David said, weakly. You were spiraling. You wouldn't eat, wouldn't sleep. Julia said it was best if you had a clean break. Landon's hands clenched. You let me believe she walked away. David looked down. I regret it. That makes 2 of us. The silence between them was cold. Landon closed the folder and leaned back in his chair. I need to know everything. Not just the letters. What else did Julia do? David ran a hand down his face. She went further than I thought. After Mira kept pushing, Julia had a cease and desist drafted. It came from the firm, but it was her idea. Mira was warned to stay away, legally. She was pregnant, Landon said, voice cracking. And Julia threatened her. David nodded. Mira didn't tell anyone. She didn't even try to fight it. I think she thought you were the one behind it. Landon stood abruptly. The chair screeched against the floor. Get out. David froze. Landon. I said, get out. David left without another word. Landon didn't move for a long time. The lies had unraveled like a thread from a tailored suit, one tug, and the whole thing fell apart. But beneath the expensive fabric and immaculate stitching, all he found was rot. Julia had known. She had orchestrated it all. And the truth sat there in his hands, scalding hot. The next morning, Landon arrived at his sister's penthouse without calling ahead. The doorman tried to stop him. He didn't succeed. Julia was in her sun-drenched living room, sipping espresso and scrolling through her phone. She looked up, unfazed by his intrusion. To what do I owe the pleasure? She asked. He held up the folder. Don't play with me. She didn't flinch. Ah. So she finally showed up. You knew. I did. You lied. I protected you. He crossed the room in 2 strides. From what? The woman I loved. The family I never got to meet. You were weak after she left, Julia said, standing now, fire in her voice. I saw you crumbling. You would have destroyed everything, your business, your legacy, yourself. I could have handled the truth. No, you couldn't. You were already on edge, already doubting everything. She would have dragged you down with her. She wasn't a threat. She was pregnant. Julia's face paled. I didn't know that. Don't lie to me again. I didn't, she snapped. I knew she was calling. I knew she was writing. But I didn't know about the kids. But you made sure her messages never got through. I made sure you didn't self-destruct. He laughed, but there was no humor in it. You decided what I could handle. Yes, she said without apology. And I'd do it again. He stepped closer. You don't get to make that call. I made every call, she said, eyes flashing. When Mom died, when Dad's empire nearly collapsed, who do you think held you together? Who cleaned up the mess? Who made you into the man you are now? You didn't make me, he said. You stole from me. He turned and walked to the door. You're cutting me out? She asked. I already did. Landon spent the rest of the day in silence. He walked through Millennium Park, past the mirrored cloud gate and the city's heartbeat. He didn't answer texts, didn't return calls. The life he had so carefully constructed felt foreign to him now. Later that evening, he stood outside Myra's hotel room. He raised his hand to knock, then stopped. He had rehearsed 100 versions of this conversation. None of them felt right. When she opened the door, she didn't smile. Can we talk? He asked. She nodded and stepped aside. The girls were already asleep. The room smelled like lavender shampoo and popcorn. The TV was playing some old cartoon, muted. He sat on the edge of the couch. Mira stood by the window, arms folded. I found out the truth, he said. Julia intercepted everything. She sent the legal threat. She blocked the letters. She didn't want me to know. Myra's jaw clenched. And David, Landon continued. He helped. Or he didn't stop her. I don't even know which is worse. I told you, she said. I know. I didn't believe you. That's on me. The silence between them was thick, but not empty. I missed everything, he said finally. Their first words. Their birthdays. Their nightmares. Their laughter. I missed it all. Myra's eyes shimmered. I tried. I know. I begged. I know. They thought you didn't care. His voice broke. I did. She crossed the room slowly. I don't want to punish you, she said. That's never what this was about. Then what was it about? She took a long breath. It was about the truth. About the girls knowing where they came from. About you knowing what you lost. He looked at her, eyes raw. I want to know them. If you'll let me. She didn't speak. I'm not asking for forgiveness, he said. I'm asking for a chance. She hesitated. Then nodded. Autumn in Chicago was quieter than Landon remembered. Or maybe it was just him who had changed. A month had passed since the wedding that never was. Since the truth detonated in the center of his world and left him staring at the broken pieces of the life he thought he'd built. He hadn't returned to his office at Hayes Capital. He had left his assistant to manage the board's expectations, paused deals that once seemed urgent, and cancelled the media interviews that came like vultures in the days after Mira walked into that ballroom. The headlines had screamed betrayal, secret children, a broken engagement. But Landon didn't care. For once, public perception took a back seat to something real. He had more important things to do. He rented a small house near the lake. Not in the towering skyline where he used to feel powerful, but in a quiet neighborhood where laughter came from open windows and the air smelled like maple trees. It wasn't his style. That was the point. Mira didn't give him a key. But she did give him time. Time to call. Time to show up. Time to learn the details no DNA test could reveal. Sophie liked strawberry milk, but only if it was cold. She was bold, like her mother, and sometimes too quick to trust. Stella liked puzzles and stories about space. She watched everything with a quiet intensity that reminded Landon of himself. He met them for lunch in the park. He sat on the floor of Myra's hotel suite and played board games, never quite sure if he was winning or losing. He took them to the museum on weekends and let them climb on his shoulders, even when it made him feel ridiculous. It was hard. And it was holy. One evening, after he read The Little Prince aloud and both girls had fallen asleep with their heads on opposite ends of the couch, Mira sat beside him in the dim room. The silence between them was no longer tense. It was shared. They like you, she said. Landon stared at the girls. I like them more. Myra's voice was soft. You're good with them. I'm trying. You're different. I hope so. She looked at him, her eyes unreadable. I was angry for a long time, she said. Not just because you didn't know. But because when I needed someone to fight for me, no one did. Landon nodded slowly. I can't undo that. But I can fight now. Her eyes flickered. Don't promise them the world if you're not sure you can stay in it. I'm not going anywhere. People say that all the time. He turned toward her. Then let me show you, not say it. That night, as he left the hotel, he passed a florist still open late. He paused, bought a small bouquet of wildflowers, and left them at Myra's door the next morning with a note that read, "For the years you had to carry everything alone. I see you now." She never said thank you. But she didn't throw them away. Over the next weeks, Landon adjusted. Not just his schedule or his zip code. But his priorities. He stopped attending galas. Stopped pretending perfection. He sat in court-mandated mediation sessions to formalize paternity and parental rights, even when the idea of scheduling time with his own daughters made his skin crawl. He did it because Mira asked him to. And because she was right. They weren't a couple. Not yet. Maybe never again. But they were co-parents. And that mattered more than pride. One Saturday afternoon, he arrived at Myra's apartment to find her packing a picnic basket. The girls were already in the car. She looked up at him, then down at the Tupperware in her hand. "We're going to Grant Park. You coming?" He smiled. "Always." They sat in the grass that day, all four of them, watching Sophie chase bubbles while Stella read a comic book under a tree. Mira leaned back on her elbows, her face lifted toward the sun. "They laugh more when you're around," she said. "I laugh more when I'm around them." She didn't say anything for a while. Then she asked, "Do you miss it?" He looked at her. "Your old life," she clarified. "The suits. The skyline. The control." He thought about it. "No," he said. "Not even a little." He smiled faintly. That life was impressive. But it wasn't honest. She turned her head to study him. "And this? This is the first thing that's ever felt true." The wind moved gently between them. Later that evening, as he carried a sleeping Sophie to Myra's car and tucked her into the back seat, Mira touched his arm lightly. "I found a school," she said. "Near your new place." He looked at her. "I'm considering staying," she added, voice steady but cautious. "Longer than I thought." His heart caught. "You mean?" "I don't know what I mean yet," she said. "But the girls are happy. And that matters more than what I'm afraid of." He nodded slowly. "We can build something here. We're not the same people, Landon." "No. But maybe that's good." She smiled, barely. And then she whispered, "We'll see." A week later, Landon invited them over for dinner. He cooked. Badly. Mira brought takeout as backup. The girls laughed so hard they cried when Landon tried to flip pancakes and hit the ceiling instead. After the girls were in bed, Mira helped him clean the dishes in silence. Her sleeves were rolled up. Her hair was messy. She looked more beautiful than she ever had in heels. "Do you regret it?" he asked. "What?" "Walking away." She dried a plate slowly. "I regret the silence," she said. "But not protecting them. I want to be someone they never have to be protected from again." She looked at him. And this time, she didn't pull away when he reached for her hand. The world didn't shift. It didn't erupt into fireworks. But something real passed between them. Something earned. A beginning. Weeks turned to months. Fall turned to winter. Landon took the girls ice skating and bought them matching scarves. Mira let him take them overnight once a week. Sophie called him Dad for the first time without hesitation. Stella drew a picture of the four of them holding hands and stuck it on the fridge. He cried when he saw it. Not loudly. Not with drama. But quietly, in the car afterward. Because it was working. Because the road back home hadn't been straight. But it had been worth every twist. And one snowy morning in January, when Mira showed up at his door with coffee and gloves too small for her hands, Landon opened the door and smiled. "You cold?" She shook her head. "Just thought maybe I'd stay a while." He stepped aside. And she walked in. Not because she had to. But because, finally, she could. And as the door closed behind her, the past remained what it was, broken, bruised, unfinished. But the future? It was just beginning. In the heart of Chicago's gleaming skyline once stood a man named Landon Hayes, a name synonymous with power, precision, and control. Landon was the kind of man who appeared on magazine covers, who made headlines not for scandals but for billion-dollar acquisitions, calculated business triumphs, and sharp financial foresight. He had built Hayes Capital from the ground up after severing every tie to the chaos of his past, including the woman he once believed had betrayed him. His world was a masterpiece of perfection. But beneath the luxury, the tailored suits, and the towering boardrooms was a heart that never truly healed. For years, Landon told himself that Mira Calloway had abandoned him. That she had disappeared without warning, without goodbye, without reason. He believed it so thoroughly that he buried the pain under ambition, mistaking success for closure. When he became engaged to Isabel Rothschild, daughter of a legacy family, poised and powerful, it wasn't for love. It was strategy. Alignment. Empire. But everything changed on the night of what was supposed to be his crowning glory, the wedding. Mira appeared. Not alone. She brought with her 2 little girls, Sophie and Stella, mirror images of Landon himself. Identical twin daughters he never knew existed. In an instant, the room froze. His world unraveled. All the power, the press, the prestige, none of it could hold a candle to the truth that stood before him. 2 small faces shattered 8 years of carefully constructed lies. And behind them, the one woman he had never stopped loving, no matter how hard he tried. What followed was not an easy road. At first, there was disbelief. Rage. Accusations. Then, revelation. The truth was far more brutal than fiction. Mira hadn't left without explanation. She had tried to call, to write, to stand at his office doors, begging for a moment of his time. But every message had been intercepted. Every attempt to reach him erased. By the people he trusted most. Julia Hayes, his sister and the shadow behind his empire, had orchestrated a complete severance. David, his closest advisor, had stood complicit. All in the name of protecting Landon from a future they deemed unworthy. A future with Mira. When Landon finally discovered the web of deceit, it nearly broke him. But instead of retreating into his empire, he made a choice that changed everything. He stepped down from his pedestal. He showed up, not in boardrooms, but on playgrounds. He learned his daughter's favorite books. He held Myra's silence with reverence and earned her trust without rushing her forgiveness. He bought a home not to impress, but to be near the only people who had ever made him feel whole. It was awkward at first. Humbling. Terrifying. But it was also real. For the first time, Landon wasn't building a kingdom for strangers to admire. He was building a home, for Sophie and Stella to feel safe. For Mira to find rest. And for himself to finally be free from the lie that success could ever replace love. Over time, walls fell. Not in one dramatic gesture. But in tiny, ordinary moments. A shared picnic in the park. A puzzle solved together. A bedtime story read by a man who once thought he didn't have what it took to be a father. Sophie, the bold one, began calling him Dad with ease. Stella, ever watchful, quietly drew him into her world with questions and sidelong glances until one day, she simply took his hand without asking. Mira, cautious and bruised by history, stood by, watching the man she once knew become someone stronger. Not the man who had broken her heart. But the one who was slowly, gently, mending what had been broken. Landon did not beg to be forgiven. He lived in a way that made forgiveness possible. And in the slow rhythm of presence, laughter, and honesty, the 3 of them, Mira, Sophie, and Stella, made space for him again. Not because he was wealthy. But because he finally understood what true wealth meant. Not assets. Not prestige. But being known. And loved anyway. And when Mira finally stepped through the door of his quiet little home near the lake with a cup of coffee in her hands and said, "I thought maybe I'd stay a while," Landon knew. He had come all the way back home. Not to a place. But to the people who mattered most. The lesson, what this story teaches us about life, love, and legacy. At its core, this isn't just a story about a millionaire finding his long-lost family. It's about what happens when the scaffolding of success collapses and forces you to ask, what truly matters? Landon Hayes had everything: money, power, respect. But what he lacked was connection. Vulnerability. Presence. The very things he once believed made him weak, were in fact, the things that would make him whole. Myra's strength wasn't just in leaving, it was in enduring. In raising her children with grace, without bitterness. In protecting their hearts until truth had a safe place to land. And Sophie and Stella? They are a reminder that even when adults fail, children still offer the gift of second chances. If only we are brave enough to show up. So, what can we learn from this? First, never assume silence is the same as closure. Sometimes, what we think is betrayal is really just a message we never received. Always seek the whole truth. Even if it's uncomfortable. Second, power without presence is empty. You can build towers, fortunes, and legacies, but if there's no one to share it with, if the people you love aren't part of that story, what have you truly built? Third, healing takes humility. Landon didn't fix his mistakes with grand apologies. He fixed them by listening. By being patient. By showing up, again and again, even when it was awkward, even when it hurt. And finally, forgiveness isn't about forgetting the past. It's about building a new future, brick by brick, together. How can you apply this to your own life? Ask yourself. Who have you lost touch with that still lives in the back of your heart? Have you ever assumed the worst of someone, only to realize later that you never knew the full story? Are you chasing achievements, hoping they'll fill a void only love can reach? Are you waiting to be perfect before you let yourself be known? You don't have to be a billionaire to make things right. You just have to be willing to start. Call the person you haven't spoken to. Apologize, even if it's been years. Show up, not with answers, but with presence. The road back home is rarely straight. But every step you take in love is a step towards something real. Before you go. If this story moved you, if it made you feel something deep, or reminded you of what truly matters, then we invite you to subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us create more stories that stir the soul, remind us of our humanity, and push us to live with more intention, compassion, and courage. Help us keep telling stories that matter. Click subscribe now, and be the first to hear the next journey of love, redemption, and truth. Because sometimes, the most powerful stories are the ones that bring us home.